Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Joe's family, may I thank you for your presence here, whether via the internet or in person. We thank you for being here and for being a part of this service of remembrance for Joe. Those of you who are considering memorial contributions in Joe's memory, the family would be most grateful if you would direct them toward the Opera Theater of St. Louis, the St. Louis Zoo, and Congregation Temple Israel. I'm Rabbi Shook, and it was my pleasure to be a sparring partner with Joe for many years. Joe taught me that at least somebody, one person, listened to the rabbi's sermons, because he was very, very likely to come up at the end of the evening, the Shabbat service, and tell you what he thought. And I cherish those moments because it sharpened my need and my desire to make sure that when I said something from the pulpit, it could pass the Joe Losos muster. Birth is a beginning and death a destination. And life is a journey. From childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength and strength to weakness and often back again, from health to sickness and back we pray to health again, from offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, from pain to compassion, from grief to understanding, and from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until looking backward or ahead, we see that victory in life lies not in some high place along the way, but in having made the sacred journey of life, making it a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning, and death a destination. And life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage to life everlasting.
In ancient people, we are well acquainted with grief. And in this time of loss and reflection, we turn our hearts and our minds to our sacred scriptures and our ancient songs that bring us and have brought Joe so much comfort, so much strength. Esaenai El Harim Me'ain Yavo Ezri Me'im Adonai Ose Shamayim Va'aretz Ezri Me'im Adonai Ose Shamayim Va'aretz. In my time of struggle, I raise up my eyes to the mountains. From where does my help come? My help comes from God, who created all life. And who also sees over the creation and the fall of all things in this universe. as it is written, and as Joe liked to read. For everything there is a season, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak.
We are taught that in his sorrow, Job cried out, Adonai natan va'Adonai lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai mevarach. God has given and God has taken away. So we bless the name of God. An ancient people, we are well acquainted with grief and with the valley of shadows. Death and sorrow are not strangers to us. Yet the centuries have taught us that a good name endures beyond the grave, and that there is strength in faith. So with Job we say, Adonai natan. God, you gave us a loved one who will not be forgotten. And for all that was so good and precious in his life, we offer you the deepest thanks of our hearts. And now, Adonai lakach. God, you've taken away. We pray for the strength to turn our broken hearts into an altar of trust before which we acknowledge your sovereignty and we say, Yehi Shem Adonai mevarach. Blessed be the name of God, now and forever. And we take just a few moments of silent prayer as we remember Joe. Imre fi Legion libi lefanecha Adonai tzuri Adonai tzuri Legoali It's now my honor to invite forward some of the members of Joe's family to share a few recollections and words about his life.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Jonathan Losos. I'm the oldest of Joe's offspring. You'll hear from each of us in turn, and then from a few others. If there's one thing you know about my dad, it's that he loved books. He loved everything about them: their look, their smell, their feel. Not to mention the knowledge that resided within them. If you ever visited my parents' house, you undoubtedly saw his 3-story library. Perhaps you even went up the spiral staircase, after taking your shoes off, of course. Last week, I counted the number of books in Dad's library. 3,490, in case you're wondering. And he read all of them, some of them multiple times. Someone once said, you can judge a man by the books in his library. That may be so, but I think that's only part of the story. It's not only the books that are there, but how he keeps the library itself. And Dad's library was pure Dad. Take, for example, his fastidiousness. Not only the no shoes on the second floor rule, but also the care with which each book was treated, each a precious treasure. Then there was the no lending rule. Indeed, not even his children were allowed to remove a book from his library, not even to take it into the living room to read. Dad discussed his perspective on human nature in his 1968 book, Custom and Reason, but I think his loan policy tells you all you need to know about his views of his fellow man. Then there were the rules that existed just because Dad liked it that way. And once such a rule was put in place, there was no changing it. Just like you couldn't change Dad's opinion once he'd made up his mind. One of Dad's traditions was to keep the dust jacket on the book while he was reading it until he finished it. Then, if the book was deemed worthy of a place in his library, and many were not, the accession ritual included removing the dust jacket and tearing it in half. Why, you ask? No one's really sure. We think he just thought books were prettier when their hardcovers were visible. And you might ask in this case, what about paperback books? Forget about it. There was a strict prohibition against the softback, which Dad considered an inferior product. Dad never put a paperback in his library. Never? Well, hardly ever. Of course, the contents of the library say a lot about a person as well, and Dad's ensemble was as eclectic and wide-ranging as his interests. The contents span the 12-volume Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, at 240 years old, the elder statesman of his collection, bound volumes of National Geographic from the 1930s, biographies of every major statesman the world has ever seen, and many minor ones as well, yearly editions of Architectural Digest, and Morris the Cat's autobiography. Fiction was barely present. The lion's share of books fell into 4 categories: history, political economy, art, and animals. As you can imagine, when growing up in the Losos family, there was a strong emphasis on reading, knowledge, and the world of the mind. It all started when we were little, and Dad would read books to us, changing one word on each page to make sure we were paying attention. It soon became a great game to be the first one to catch this transmutation. Mr. Popper's Penguins, The Wizard of Oz, and Alice in Wonderland were among many that to this day remain family treasures. And as we'll hear in a few minutes, the tradition was resurrected in the younger generation. Each of Dad's children map onto a different section of the library, as Louise will explain more fully later. Although all of us, to some extent, are interested in animals, I am the one who became a zoologist. What many of you probably don't know is that as a boy, Dad wanted to be a zoologist. Indeed, one of the most treasured possessions I have is this book here. It's Dad's copy of Who's Who in the Zoo, published in 1937 when Dad was 5. I can picture the young bookworm Joe sitting cross-legged, poring over this book, becoming fascinated in the natural world around him. And fear not, I did not remove the book from Dad's library. I know better than that. Rather, it is the first book I remember from my own bookshelves when I was a little boy growing up on Lay Road. Dad must have placed it there. 30 years after Dad had been captivated by it, it cast its spell on me, just as it did with Dad. Leafing through it last night, something I haven't done in many decades, brought back many memories of my childhood and reading with Dad. Dad clearly did not pursue his early zoological interest. Something went terribly wrong, and he ended up as a stockbroker and other pursuits. But he was delighted to pass his love of animals on to me and my sisters. He did much to encourage me in this respect, not the least of which was permitting me to acquire baby alligators as pets when I was 10. My mom gets a lot of credit, too, for her tolerance on this one. At one point during my studies, my determination to become a zoologist flagged, and I pondered going to law school. Dad was adamant. The world doesn't need more lawyers, he said. Your talents would be much more useful if you became a herpetologist. And so I did. Finally, any mention of my dad and animals must mention cats. Dad loved cats. As with so many of his other traits, Dad passed his love of cats on to the rest of us, and the extended family now includes 8 felines in 4 households. Dad claimed to have a special affinity for cats, and often mentioned that he thought he had been a cat in a previous life. He told us that his current cat, Akhenaten, the world's greatest cat, could not only understand English, but the two of them were able to converse with each other. We had our doubts, but in the last few weeks of his life, a home health care worker stayed overnight in the bedroom with him every night. And one night, Johnny reported, Akhenaten had jumped up on the bed, and the cat and my dad then commenced a 20-minute conversation, meowing back and forth to each other. So maybe Dad was right all these years after all, that he could speak cat, and maybe he did actually live a previous life as a feline. I'd like to believe so, and moreover, I'd like to think that this is not the end, that Dad will come back in feline form again, and I envy the people with whom he'll live. May you be at peace, Dad, and farewell at whatever comes next. All of your family, 2-legged and 4-legged, loves you and misses you dearly.
Thank you all for joining us here. I'm Elizabeth, the second in the lineage and the oldest daughter. When I was very young, I thought that my father was the smartest man in the world. And as I grew into my adolescence, I wised up and figured out that he didn't actually know everything. But then when I became a young adult, I realized that I was actually right the first time, that he was and continued to be for the rest of my life the smartest and most intellectual person I ever knew. His love and encyclopedic knowledge of history is renowned. I will not regale you all with stories of this because you're going to hear more of them with other speakers today. And also many of you have experienced firsthand what it's like to engage with my father on virtually every topic starting about 5000 BC to the present in any geography of the world. What many of you probably don't know is that he also had a love of numbers. He had great facility with mathematics, especially arithmetic, where most people who had problems falling asleep would count sheep. My father would calculate square roots or multiply 4 or 5-digit numbers in his head to evoke a slumber. But what I want to talk about most today is another trait that my father's that I equally admire, his wry wit. When I was very young, I thought my father had the most clever sense of humor in the world. And as I grew into my adolescence, I realized that his jokes, especially his puns, really weren't all that funny. And then as I became a young adult, I realized that I was right the second time. Most of his puns were awful. But I revered my father, and so I felt if you can't beat him, join him. I adopted my dad's humor, and we sparred together, as with Rabbi Shook, for the next 3 to 4 decades. We would volley back our puns back and forth until someone finally threw in the towel. And then, of course, we graded each other's puns, and we were pretty tough graders. One would say, "That was really awful, you get a C+." And the other would say, "Yours was worse, a C-." On the rare occasion that one of us would say something truly clever, the other happily admitted it, although A's and A+ were very hard to come by in our books. But my father's humor was more than just his trademark punning. He delighted in telling jokes, and Carol will give you more on this shortly. He also had a great love of both word and number play. For example, instead of marking time in years, as most people do, he liked to mark it in months or even days. Pops, by the way, happy 32,545th day birthday. We all were infected by this type of enthusiasm. So our family planned a great summer trip for this last summer before the pandemic struck. We were going to go celebrate with my father on July 4th, his 1066-month birthday in Hastings, England. And for those of you who aren't history buffs, you may remember that 1066 represents the Battle of Hastings. It was a bit later that we realized that the day before, July 3rd, would be my parents' 60th wedding anniversary. So it was an added bonus that we could also celebrate that in the UK, where they took their honeymoon. I have a treasure trove of such stories that my family likes to tell and retell and retell. And in fact, we tell them to each other so often that we've numbered all of our stories and just refer to them by number. Let me give you an example. Story 421. 421, for those of you who don't know it, 421A is when I was a Girl Scout and my mom was my leader, and we returned from a weekend camping trip. My father was waiting for us, very concerned about this is a cat story, of course, about his new cat, our new cat, Felix. "Dear," he said, "Felix is looking a little listless." My mom took one look at Felix and said, "Dear, Felix isn't listless, Felix is dead." Story 421B is the follow-up. My father took Felix and very respectfully and ceremoniously placed him in the trash can, covered it, and read several passages of Ecclesiastes, just as we heard earlier today. May Felix's memory be a blessing. I could go on with stories and memories of my father, 581B, 421C, and of course the early one, 21A. But I don't want to hold everyone here hostage for the rest of the day. Instead, I want to end with the two most recent stories that will be added to our family story catalog. The first one is from just 2 days ago. My brother thinks that this story is not appropriate for today's solemn occasion, but he's worried that it is too grave and that it will bury my other comments, especially if I give it with a deadpan expression. But I think I will undertake it anyway, so here it goes. My sister and I, Carol, spent the wee hours of Sunday morning with my father in his bedroom, my mother sleeping in the bed at his side. I noticed a silence from his labored breathing, so got up to go try and determine if he was still breathing, and soon called Carol to help me determine that. After 5 minutes of trying to ascertain whether he was still breathing or not, we decided that it was time to wake up my mother. So we woke her up and said, "Mom, Dad is looking a little listless." Too soon, perhaps, but unorthodox enough that I think that Pops wouldn't mind. He'd probably give a wry chuckle, but probably only a B+. And finally, a few weeks earlier, we celebrated my father's 89th birthday. It was a really joyful day, the last strong day he had before going into the hospital. He was especially pleased when he realized that turning 89, he would once again be a prime number, which he hadn't been in 6 years. He wouldn't turn prime again until the age of 97. So here's to you, Pops, for reaching the prime of your life. You will remain prime with me forever.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us, however and wherever you are. I'm Carol, the third child, and also the older of the little kids. I would like to start by sharing one of my father's favorite stories, and I request your indulgences as I make a few modifications to it. Consider it like changing a word on every page. There once was a very erudite man on a lecture tour. Let's call him Joe. He was driven by his reliable chauffeur, Carolyn. I don't really recall what the subject of his talk was. Maybe it was 19th century French political history based on his primary research of French government documents, of course written in French, by the way, a language which he had never studied before. Maybe the history of the Supreme Court, as he had read every Supreme Court decision since his law school days. Or an architectural premise on Frank Lloyd Wright, as he had once researched Frank Lloyd Wright and ghosted his wife's pioneer papers. Regardless, as they were driving to his next gig, let's say here at Temple Israel, where Joe had been a member his entire life. His mother had been confirmed here. He had been confirmed here. He was a bar mitzvah here during World War II, when bar mitzvah were rare in Reform Judaism. He served on the temple board. He spent countless hours in the library while his children were at Sunday school. Carolyn turned to him carefully while she was driving and said, "Joe, I've heard that speech so many times, I could give it." So they switched places, and somehow the audience at Temple Israel didn't notice. Carolyn, of course, delivered the talk flawlessly, but they forgot Q&A. First questions were softballs, she handled them, but then came a complicated one. Carolyn panicked a moment but collected herself, looked the person in the eye, and replied, "That is the stupidest question I've ever heard. It's so simple-minded, even my chauffeur Joe could answer it." Thanks for the laughter. Growing up, as you've heard, it did indeed seem as if my father could answer any question. These past few weeks, we've been reminiscing and poring through family photo albums. Mom pulled out a box of Dad's old letters. I read just a few randomly, but in them I learned a bit more about my father. While he described himself as a man who wasn't sure of everything and questioned himself, they did describe the Joe Losos that I later knew as Dad. Letters typed to his best friend Alexander in the 1950s, between law school and the Army, were loaded with explanations, musings, and proclamations on Baroque art, Proust, politics, history of ancient Rome, and his beloved Harvard, the place where he really first found himself. I'd like to share just a couple of the passages from the letters with you, if you don't mind. 12 July 1955, which is of course how my father wrote the date or typed it out. In fact, I know few people our age who really know what they want to do. Everything seems so provisional now. 1955 may be a turning point in world history. Or we may see a hydrogen war any year, and I can't make up my mind whether that is of real importance to me or a matter to feed my intellectual dilettantism. And this is the line I've repeated to anybody who would listen. He wrote, "If nothing else, I shall always be an intellectual dilettante. It is my life's mission." 6 September 1955. Last Friday, I underwent the pre-induction physical exam. At the end of the thing, the young doctor inquired about my interests. I always feel that I look so potently intellectual, and to avoid which I feared would be painful bantering, I remarked that I liked to read. Later, I saw his comment on the report. One who loves seclusion and who is eccentric. Alexander, we have been weighed in the balance and found eccentric. I could see the delight in the exclamation point he put after the word eccentric. But I take exception with 2 points. Number one, my mother cured him of seclusion in their 60-year marriage. And number two, Dad did not like to read. He loved to read. I am lucky I got to say goodbye to my father. But as I scanned the letter, I realized I never thanked him for teaching me to love books, to love to read. In fact, I cannot fall asleep at night unless I've read a book just before bed. So thank you, Dad, for the life of books. As Jonathan pointed out, there were just a few novels in my dad's library. One day when I was 16, I remember I pulled a book off his shelves. Looking back, I'm not sure why it was not assigned for school reading. I did take it out of the library to the adjacent living room. I curled up on the couch that still sits in my parents' basement, recovered several times. The sun was streaming into the room, and for the first time, I read Pride and Prejudice and experienced the surprise that Mr. Darcy and Lizzie Bennet get together. Sorry for the spoiler alert. It is my all-time favorite book. I've read and reread it maybe a dozen times. This morning, I walked into your library, Dad. I took off my shoes and went up to the second floor. I found Pride and Prejudice. There's nothing valuable about his edition, your edition, Dad. In fact, I have 3 copies of P&P at home, including a large, lush, annotated version. But this is the most special edition to me. This morning, I broke the cardinal rule. I removed the book from the library, indeed from the house. I plan to read it once more and pay special attention to the Father, Mr. Bennet, and then place it in my very own library at home. Not in the Jane Austen section, but rather next to my copy of Custom and Reason.
Good morning. I am the youngest of the Losos siblings, usually referred to as the baby in the family. You never outgrow that, Tessa, just so you know. And there are some advantages to being the youngest. For one thing, once you reach a certain age, you get to remind your older siblings how much older they are than you for the rest of your life. And in this case, it allows me to go last. Most of you watching this, either here or streaming, know that my dad was a stubborn man with a contentious and at times cantankerous spirit. In the last few weeks, that spirit has been on display. You could say he has done as he has always done and lived life on his own terms. What this has meant is that he has given us a great gift. These last 3 weeks together, the family has gathered, and the 6 of us, or 5 of us, have played games, we've looked at scrapbooks, we've shared stories, and we have laughed a lot. We 4 are very much a product of both of our parents, but today is about my dad. My sister Carol, as you just heard, inherited his love of reading. I think we all inherited that love, but also inherited his love of art history. As my siblings have already told you, he was a voracious reader, and he remembered everything he read. He had the ability to read books about the same historical person decades apart and synthesize the themes of those 2 books. it was a bit daunting. For Carol, they could go down the path of talking about art history to the point where I could not follow anymore. But she had another gift. My dad was not, shall we say, the most generous of gift receivers. In fact, I remember a Christmas, years ago, when one of my siblings, who will remain anonymous, gave my dad, I remember it as a stuffed elephant. They said they thought it was a blow-up, and it was actually a great gift. It was related to something at the time that I don't remember. My dad looked at it, we took a picture, and then he said, "Now what am I supposed to do with this?" And we'd all felt at some time or another a gift that we had spent countless hours buying that just didn't quite work. But not Carol. Carol was the one person who could give my dad a book. And I'm not talking about a book he had told us he wanted ahead of time. She could always find just the right book that he loved, and often did find a place in the library. My sister Elizabeth, as you've already heard, inherited his love of puns, much to her own children's chagrin. Occasionally, I could come up with a good one that received kudos from Dad, and I never had the courage to tell them that usually they were completely accidental. I didn't want to disappoint him. She also inherited, shall we say, his environmental consciousness. Back in the day when buying a car with air conditioning cost extra money, he never did. But there came a time when you could buy a car and you would have to spend extra money to not get air conditioning. And my dad faced a conundrum. Did his fiscal sense came into conflict with his environmental sense, and he weighed the options and decided that his fiscal sense would win, and he bought the car with the air conditioning. I will tell you, buying it and actually turning it on were two completely different things. And then, of course, there's Jonathan. Jonathan inherited my father's love of games, which includes an incredible competitiveness, and most importantly, an obvious love of animals. As children, and his grandchildren felt this too, we spent a lot of time at the zoo. And we particularly visited two animals, Siegfried the walrus and, of course, Elephant Carolyn. I remember going to the zoo and going up to Siegfried's enclosure, which was, in retrospect, just a really big bathtub. And my dad would slap the wall until Siegfried came up, and then he would scratch him on his whiskers. And anyone from the zoo who's watching is probably quite appalled that we actually were touching these zoo animals. And of course, there was Elephant Carolyn, for whom we had birthday parties for years, and for whom I still am upset that I was the only one who didn't get to take a ride on her. But he also gave us the love of animals in our home. We had cats and a dog that he tolerated, and we also had lizards and caimans. And by we, I do mean Jonathan. My dad loved it. He loved those caimans, those little alligators. I hated them. I still do. They were not nice creatures. But my dad believed to the very end that if he fed them, that they would eventually recognize him and warm up to them, and that he could then, I don't know, play with them, hold them. Despite my dad's best effort, they never did. The phrase, bite the hand that feeds you, to the day they would always try and bite him, to the day they either escaped or eventually passed on. But my dad, he loved every minute of it. And I think one of his proudest moments was when Jonathan became a tenured professor of Harvard, because it combined three of his great loves: his love of animals, his love of Harvard, and of course, the love of his son. And then there's me. They did such a good job. Okay. Dad and I shared a love of history. I do remember coming into high school to my AP history teacher. Sorry, just one second. And I would say to her, you know, my father and I were talking about the class we had yesterday in the lesson, and he disagreed with your take on history. As a former history teacher, I can well imagine how much she loved the fact that I would do that. But it was a source of great love that we could talk about what I was studying. No matter how obscure, he would know about it, whether it was my honors thesis on Samuel Pepys, where I could make a random Pepys reference and he would get it when no one else would, because he really did know pretty much anything in history that you could come up with. It was deep and it was real. Later on, when I was an adult and my mom would travel, as she did regularly, we would go out to dinner with Dad, Beth and I would, and we would love to get him talking either about family history or just history. And we could come up with we could say, Dad, what was in your mind the best naval battle in history? Because maybe he was reading about that. We would say to him, so Dad, who do you think had a more corrupt administration, Trump or Grant? And he could talk about it, and he would go on, and we just loved it. And we could talk about, what was going on in the events of today and how they compared in history and where they were. And standing here on the bima today, my dad also loved Temple Israel, and he wrote the 90th history, the commemorating TI's 90th history. I am sure there was a reason why they had him write a book on the 90th history. It seems a little bit of a random date. But I recommend to anyone who is a member to read it because it's a really good read. He was a wonderful writer. As Rabbi Amy could tell you, it took them a while to convince me to take on the role that I have currently. And one of the final decision-making points was I knew that my dad would love it, that he would be so proud of me, and that it would in some way kind of fulfill the destiny that my grandfather started when he was an early member upon coming here to Temple. My dad was not a warm, fuzzy father. He wasn't the kind who was going to play catch with you in the backyard or roll around on the floor with him. But he loved us, and we knew that. He took me to all my Little League games, which, as you can well imagine, was not in his wheelhouse. He was not a lover of sport in any way, shape, or form. But he had this folding chair. This was back in the day before everyone had those chairs in a bag. And it was one of those nylon woven, just raggedy chairs, and it had a lot of work. And he would take me to my game, and he would set up the chair, and he always brought a book with him, and he would read. Now, he would pay attention to a degree. He always wanted to see if I was at bat or if I was involved. But if I wasn't, he was just going to read his book. And I have this memory one time of a soccer ball actually literally going under his chair. My teammate recovered it, threw it back in, and he actually never looked up. He was there, and so he was present in my life. And there was one time, and it was so typically Dad, we were driving home from a game that I'd lost, which was unfortunately a fairly common occurrence, and I was complaining about the officiating, as anyone who's on sports teams will do, and my dad said to me, "Really? I just thought they were better than you all were." Probably true, but that was Dad. And later in life, when I got diagnosed with cancer, Dad started to call just to chat, and that was not Dad. That was Mom's job. Mom would call, say, "How are you doing?" Especially, after the chemo treatments. But Dad started to do that, and I realized that was his way of saying that I love you and I care about you. And so, Dad, I think it is quite obvious that it takes four of us to make one of you. And we love you, and we will miss you. And thank you for this remarkable life.
Hello, everyone. Hello, I'm Hannah. I'm the oldest of the grandchildren, and I'm very happy to be kicking off our segment. I'm a bit of a crier, so just gonna try and get through this. Okay, I'll go into the mic. I really love my grandparents. Most of my friends who are my age either never really got the chance to know their grandparents or just saw them once a year around the holidays, but not me and not us. My grandparents have always been an essential part of my life from my early childhood years, teenagerhood, and especially throughout college. It's impossible to state how much Carolyn and Joe have impacted my self-confidence, intellectual development, love of the city of St. Louis, and idea of how to be a good member of a community. People always used to ask if I chose to go to WashU to be close to my family, and I don't know if I actually did subconsciously. At the time, I just really liked the campus tour guide. He seemed nice and smart and happy at school, so WashU it was. But over time, I realized that going to WashU meant 4 special years of lunches, brunches, long dinners, birthdays, Jewish holidays, and laundry dates with my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and beloved extended family. For most people, when they think of college, they think of dorm parties, late-night food runs, staying up all night studying for tests, drinking too much, and being hungover in class. For me, when I think of college, I obviously think of all of those things, but I also think of going to House of India with the Losos clan, being slightly hungover at brunch, working on a term paper in Carolyn's study in those big black chairs, with Joe in the chair next to me, reading a book with Otten at his feet, or walking into my grandparents' house to do a load of laundry and hearing opera blasting at full volume from Joe's library. The two memories of college and of my grandparents are inextricable. My grandparents were there for me in college at the very beginning, when I had no friends, no furniture, and no clue how to live on my own. They were there when things got hard and I needed a place to go off campus for a few hours to de-stress. 8957 was my oasis. They listened to me talk about interesting classes, internship possibilities, and improv drama. They were my pillars of support, and I can't imagine college without either of them. A few weeks ago, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, I drove over to my grandparents to watch services. We had gotten the news of Joe's diagnosis earlier that day, and it was a slightly solemn affair. Still, we all got to proudly watch Louise virtually address Temple Israel from the comfort of my grandparents' bedroom, and then had dinner in the dining room. At some point, the conversation shifted to the origin of the phrase, chickaburger. I could not tell you what the root of the phrase was. I just remember that the funniest thing in the world to me when I was younger was my grandfather's joke. Knock, knock. Who's there? Chickaburger. What does that even mean? But it never gets old. When I got up to go and started making my way around the table to say goodbye, Carolyn exclaimed, "Joe, Hannah is leaving. Say a goodbye to her." To which Pops looked up to me and just said, "Chickaburger." And that was it. Every time I came over in the following weeks, he was asleep. His last word to me was chickaburger. When I realized I'd probably never get to talk to Pops again, and that was our final conversation, I felt a little bit sad and a little disappointed. You know, I wish I had said something witty and smart to say thank you for this beautiful family that I get to be a part of and all of the knowledge and wisdom and love that you've given me over the past 23 years. But he knows how I felt, because our final conversation isn't the one that matters. It's all the conversations that we had over coffee and bananas, trading the cartoons from the Post-Dispatch in the morning after I slept over at their house before I went back to campus. Or at dinner at a new ethnic restaurant in St. Louis that he would end up hating. Or over a game of Chinese checkers when even this summer in August, he would still kick my butt. I love my grandfather. I will miss him immensely, but I'm so grateful for those 4 years I got to spend here in St. Louis and all the time I got to spend with him. I really am the luckiest girl in the world. So if I could leave you with any last words in honor of my grandfather, I'd like to say, knock, knock. Chick burger.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle, second in line from the Liz line. So, a few years back, to celebrate Pops' 1,000th month birthday, perhaps the most important day of his life, we held, naturally, a pie baking competition. Pops, the connoisseur of pie for breakfast, would judge which one was best. As you all know, I am a perfectionist to a fault, so naturally, I wanted to bake the supreme pie. With the aid of several of you here, I peeled and diced apples, rolled out homemade dough, and meticulously assembled an apple pie. And to appeal to his mathematical sensibilities, I carved a pi symbol out of scrap dough, which I laid atop the pastry. But what's better than one homemade pie? Two. So the second pie I filled with his favorite cherry and adorned with more pie dough art. I carved out a J-O-E from the dough to spell out his name. Of course, when Graham saw my crafty pies, she was beside herself, singing their praise. Meanwhile, Ellen Gale arrived at the competition just moments before judging with a cherry pie from Schnuck's bakery department. As soon as Pops saw my pies, he immediately said, "Phooey," and turned up his nose, castigating me for pandering to the judge. In an outrageous outcome, Ellen's store-bought pie came in first place, and mine were both last. Pops never shied away from sharing his opinion, never afraid to be the single dissenting voice in the room. Pops flipped the script on what was expected. His honesty was refreshing, fair, entertaining, and true to himself. While Joe was by definition our grandfather, that was never the fitting terminology. He was indeed grandfatherly in his sagacity and his quiet but measured leadership. But the quality that left an impression on my young mind was his spirit, embodied by the nickname Pops. He blurred the line between child and adult, and proved, as you'll hear from my other cousins, that he never outgrew games or stories or learning more about the world. When I was around Pops, I strived to be my cleverest and most grown-up self, because that's how Pops treated me, like an equal. When Pops was around, I knew we'd play hide-and-go-seek in the dark. So you can bet I ate as many carrots as I could muster at dinner so that I could stump him with my superb night vision. When Pops was around, I knew we'd take on fantastical books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, so I'd better be ready to read big words and imagine great places. He taught us the proper term for reckless drivers, scumbags. He demonstrated the proper way to drink Campari, straight. And he showed us how to cherish the best things in life, a pat of butter, family, a great book, and a heaping slice of pie for breakfast. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily, the last of the Schanzer Losses, and I just want to share a very short story about Pops that I hope you all will like. Over last winter break, I was talking with him about historical events and was so impressed with the breadth of knowledge already displayed today. And so I made a game trying to quiz him. I would say any random year, and he would tell an important event that happened in that year. So I would say 1731, and he said the Treaty of Vienna was signed. 1453, the siege and fall of Constantinople. 923, the Battle of Soissons. Keep in mind, I don't know what this battle was, who was fighting it, let alone what year it occurred. 1541, Santiago, Chile is founded. I asked 1299, and Pops paused. I thought I might have stumped him, but then he looked at me and said, with a matter-of-fact expression on his face, that nothing of much importance actually happened in 1299. He said this with the authority that I knew it would be futile to try to win at this game. I was hopelessly outmatched. So I said, you want to play a card game instead? I'll always cherish these memories, and I know my cousins have a little more to say. Thank you all for everything.
Hello, I'm Jackson, the first grandson of Carol. Oh, grandson of Pops, son of Carol. Does anyone know what 17 squared is? It's not a very common one or one that should ever be remembered, and 17 is not a very interesting number. But to find it, we know that 16 squared is obviously 256, and if we add 16 and then add 17, we get 17 squared, or 289. I could still hear the tone in Pops' voice as he said, 16 squared is obviously 256. Well, we walked to school on a rainy day as I was going to third grade. On any other rainy day, I would have relished the opportunity to jump in all the puddles and get myself as soaked as possible before getting to school. But that day, and like many others like it, was the day I got to do math on the way to school with Pops. I could hear the matter-of-factness in his voice as he explained the logic behind these fun math tricks, taking large numbers on these adventures and arriving at these long-winded answers. I remember watching Pops at work explaining these, watching how he really enjoyed math, and hearing the pleasure in his voice as he told me the right answer, or hearing the joy in his voice as I came to the right answer myself. It was this enjoyment and these sorts of experiences that really got me started in loving math and loving numbers. But this is not about me. I wanted to tell that story because I wanted to talk about Pops' voice. I can still hear his baritone, "No!" as he dismissed a ridiculous idea because it could be heard across the house. But what Pops did best with his voice was reading. When Danielle and I were 6, Pops read us a story from a book of animal stories that I'm pretty sure has not been touched in 30 years called Not Quite Martin. Pops read us the story about a boy who was lost in the Kentucky mountains and stayed in an abandoned cabin for the night and encounters a series of wild animals from a cat to a puma to a bear that come in and are able to speak, but much to the dismay of Cody, the boy lost in the mountains, can only say one phrase: "We can't do nothing till Martin comes." And I don't know if, like my Aunt Liz mentioned, Pop saw himself in these animals and thought, well, those were his friends in a past life. But the story ends up actually turning out to be entirely the boy's dream, much to a very dissatisfying ending. But we begged Pops to read it year after year because of the voices he gave to the animals. He could do the door scratching of the cat and the loud crackety bang of the bear knocking down the cabin. We would watch him smile as he changed his voice from narrator to talking animal, clearly enjoying reading to us. We read the story every year, and in the past few years, Danielle and I actually took over the reading duties, reading it to him and doing our best to imitate those voices. But this past summer, we actually switched off reading pages, and I was transported back to being a 6-year-old on the couch, listening to him talk about the animals and the mountains, and listening to him give an individual voice to each of the wild animals. His voices hadn't changed at all, despite what you may think, and they were the same animals that we asked to hear from him year after year. And I watched the smile creep over his face. Sure, it wasn't the best piece of literature he had ever read, but the fun we had listening to him read it clearly had stayed with him. He enjoyed the experience as much as we did, and reading the story all those years wasn't just a special moment for us, but it was clearly important to him too. I will always hear Pops' voice, whether I'm doing math or reading a story aloud, and I hope you do too, because it's one of the many things that made him special. Thank you.
I'm Calvin. This is Tessa. We are the other 2 grandchildren and children of Carol. I only just have a few things. Sorry, one second. A few weeks ago, when Pops came home from the hospital, I came out here to visit. I hadn't been able to visit since winter, and I wanted to see everyone. I was the only grandchild in St. Louis at the time. Well, other than Hannah, but you know. Only one there since we were all social distancing. And I saw something different than I'd ever seen before. During our big family gatherings, I see my mom, my aunts, my uncles as just that. But when I visited, I saw a different family. I saw the loving family that Grandma and Pops had created. Uncle Jonathan, Aunt Liz, my mom, and Aunt Louise were all gathered around their parents, going through albums, joking with one another, and telling stories of the ridiculous things they did as kids. I sat by smiling, realizing the memories and jokes they were all sharing reminded me of a lot of me and my own siblings and cousins. Pops and Graham did something incredible. They created a family. They created a family that joins together every year. They created a family that keeps on growing. They created a family that I am so proud to be part of. Thank you, Pops. Thank you for being my role model. Thank you for everything you have done for every single one of us up here. Thank you for showing us what a family is. Thank you. We love you, Pops.
Can you hear me? It's so appropriate that we are meeting together, our family, today in this house of worship where Joe had been a member for 89 years. His mother and my mother were both confirmed here. All his children were confirmed here also. And he really was an intellectual Jewish man. I really learned from him much about the history of the Jews. He loved his religion, and of course he liked to argue about it, which was very interesting. I first met Joe in 1957 when Bill Cohn, a good friend of ours and the artist with our pictures around the house, called Joe up, who was his neighbor across the street, and said, I've just come back from Mexico and I want to keep my Spanish up. So I'm thinking we should get together with maybe 4 of us and practice talking Spanish every other week. So being a single, then Bill Cohn called me and said, are you up to it? You just came back from 3 weeks in Guadalajara, and don't you want to keep up your Spanish? The problem was my Spanish was how to teach Spanish in the elementary school. I had about this much Spanish. Anyway, so we met, and that led to doing great books groups together. It led to a lot of good times, and eventually we got married. And marriage to Joe was always interesting. As you have very well said, he had his ideas about what was right, and our life was scheduled around what was right. I loved him dearly. He's the smartest man I ever knew. He was very ethical. And he was a scholar and brought me opera and Gilbert and Sullivan and Proust, which I never finished and was his favorite book. And he brought me a different way of thinking about things. We had the kind of marriage where we respected what each other did and didn't put a lot of demands. By that, I mean, when the children were little, he read to them every night. He drove the Sunday school carpool, and he emptied the dishwasher. That was great. I made sure that I never touched a washing machine that had dirty dishes in it. But Joe had the quality of not being ashamed or not really caring what people thought about what he was doing. He was a banker, he was a financier, and he also would try to make people understand that there's always 2 sides of every question. The only problem was he liked to argue, and I am not an arguer, and I often felt that I couldn't come up to his intellectual ability. In fact, one of the children said that when Dad was in the hospital for the last time, I'm not sure which one he told it to. Was you, Lizzie? He said to Elizabeth, I want to tell you something. I don't want you to tell it to your mother. But I really do think that Trump may get elected again. Hopefully. Of course, Elizabeth told me it right away, but when you had bad times, Pops could always find a situation which was even worse, and how lucky you were. So, I have had a wonderful life. Both of us knew that we cared about St. Louis, and this was how we're going to spend the rest of our lives. And between Joe's ideas of what was right and my ideas. We had a wonderful life traveling the world. And best of all, my thanks to my whole extended family here. Because, you know, as we went through the books that we have kept for all those years, you all are on every page. However, some of the children were a little upset how there was practically an entire book about Jonathan. And Danielle, I don't think you were mentioned on one page until about 9 months later. Anyway, and you're all there, and you've been here for comfort and joy. So many thanks to the rabbis, one and all, who have made it possible for Joe to be memorialized in the wonderful place where he grew up. Many thanks to you, my family, for always standing by us. And many thanks for your understanding, support, and love. And I will tell you one thing, Trump isn't going to win.
So you all have spoken so beautifully today, as we knew you would. So I really just want to share one short thing with you. And this is a rabbinic secret that I have told Louise before, but I'm telling the rest of you, which is that every year before the high holidays, when Rabbi Michael and I are writing our sermons, we think about the congregation, and we try to make sure that there are a few specific people who we think of in the congregation, and we think, will this person appreciate and like our sermons? And one of those people every year for the past, it's been I think 15 years now, has always been Joe Losos. And it was because of just this incredible respect and admiration that we had for Joe, not just because he was a member here for 89 years, but just because he was a man who deserved that kind of respect and honor, and to whom we always wanted to give it. Now, I will also say that of those 15 years of high holiday sermons, that never once did I write a sermon which I actually thought that Joe would have liked. Because I will say, and this is not just your family, I also grew up hearing that Joe was the smartest man in St. Louis. It was just a given. And so I always knew that there was really never anything that any of us could say that would be quite up to Joe's intellectual levels. But that wasn't even an issue, because you just knew he was so incredibly smart that even just to get a moment where he might, nod his head a little bit or acknowledge you said something that was remotely smart, it was a real win. But I wanted to say just one last piece, which is that for all those years of giving sermons, and he always sat in the same place on the high holidays until, of course, this year when we couldn't be together. And he would often, after services, come up to me and say something about the sermons, and, would often argue with whatever it was I have to say. But he was always kind. No matter what he said, even if he didn't agree with me, even if he wanted to share a different perspective, he was still kind about it. He never made me feel that it wasn't smart enough or that it wasn't good enough. He still was able to show this incredible kavod, this respect, back. Because he did have not only this kindness, but he wanted for others to be able to succeed, to figure out what it was that they were best at. While he held himself up to these incredibly high standards, he held everyone else up to those as well. And he had confidence that each of us, whether you were in his family or his rabbis or just someone who he interacted with along the way, he wanted us and believed that we could all be our very best. So I will say that while I will miss seeing his face right there on sort of the left side of the bima giving my sermons, I will continue to write my sermons and think of Joe. And maybe one of these days I may actually write one that he would have really loved. But either way, I know that he would have been proud and respectful, just as he is of all of you, trying to hold us to the very best, just as he did himself. So I'll ask you now, if you will, to please rise for the words of El Malei Rachamim.
El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamsemnu Chanchona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, Im Karashim Utorim, Kezoar Rakia, Masirim, Et Nishmat Yakirenu, Shalach La'olamo, Bal Rachamim, Yastireu Baseter Knafav Le'olamim, Vayitzru B'Yisroel Chaim Et Nishmato, Adonai Nachalato, V'yanuach b'shalom Amishkavo, V'nomar Amen.
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Joe, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in your eternal presence, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And let us say together, Amen.
Earlier this morning, we had the honor of being able to say goodbye to Joe at New Mount Sinai Cemetery. And while at that time his family had the opportunity to say the mourner's Kaddish, we knew that there would be others who would wish to say so as well, who are either with us today in this room or watching from at home. So we invite you, if you wish, to join with us once again in the words of the mourner's Kaddish.
Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ba'alma divrach yirteh v'yamlich malchuteh, b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, b'agala u'bizman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam u'olmei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudusha b'richu, Le'ela amin kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, damiran ba'alma v'imru Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'mramav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen.
Osei shalom b'mramav, Hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imeru Amen.
Friends, because of the restrictions of the pandemic, the family will not be having Shiva at this time. We do hope that a year from now, God willing, when the world looks a little bit better, that we will be able to come together again and have some sort of a memorial service in honor of Joe's memory. We would invite you, if you wish, to join us for Shabbat services this Friday evening, virtually at 6:30 p.m., where again we will read his name for a blessing with the words of the mourner's Kaddish. When this does conclude our service, and so this time we'll invite his family to leave the sanctuary. Thank you.